Okay, I'm watching PBS Space Time. I haven't watched the video yet, but it says how we know our universe is ancient. I was looking at the thumbnail they used, and in that, I got an idea of what could possibly. It's just a pondering on my mind. I'm not at all a scientist, nor do I have any professionalism in that field. But I had a question of what if coming out the other end of a black hole was the creation of a new universe, and based on the gravitational and magnetic field, determines how quickly a universe will be ripped apart within that new space. So I'm trying to give an idea as to how I came up with the idea. So I'm saying, like, think of this notion of a dissolving black hole is like in a sinkhole within space itself. So either there's a sinkhole that's either created by a mass that's already residing within the location, or the existing side outside of our universe that's also a part or a possibility of a mirroring universe, either has a weak constitution within that field and it creates the sinkhole to where you wind up with materials falling into one space, creating a black hole, which I don't think that's a thing. But we haven't seen anything like that, so I can't really say that that actually isn't a thing, where other scientists probably can determine why that wouldn't be a thing. But once again, I'm not a scientist, so or any field dealing with physics or anything like that. So, and the other option would be that the space is being forced by the material that's already there, something going supernova or something in that nature, to where it creates within that non-perfect vacuum of space. There's a small atmosphere around almost everything out there. Some materials that's not necessarily breathable air like what we get on Earth, but there's still atmosphere around that object based on its gravitational field and the particles that's within that field. Don't mean that life can be sustained in that area. It just means there's atmosphere around it. So Mars also has an atmosphere because of that. And there's also some areas within Mars itself that allow for that. Unlike our moon, which don't have much of anything on its surface to actually create an atmosphere around it. So it's determined based on the body itself or the size of the body itself in order to create those things, such as the atmosphere, and it has to have some chemical thing happening on it in order for it to actually create that atmosphere. But beside the point, with that, something going supernova, it pushes and creates even more atmosphere within that area. It goes supernova or implodes on itself. And then imploding, I'm thinking maybe it has something in conjunction with the other side, that mirrored side of a universe on the other side of us not having enough materials in it to where it creates that void, and it could possibly determine that something might implode versus something expanding and creating that void itself, and then that determining what type of black hole you're gonna get. Oh yeah, so let me go over what else I wrote here so as to stay on topic. So it's looking for that mass or that void that's created by the supernova, either the mirroring universe looking for more materials to fall into it so it can actually sustain the space, or in the supernova itself, in expansion of space, it pushes space itself, and then whatever's holding it there, creating that atmosphere, you get a backdraft effect that happens, and all that material with its magnetic fields and its gravitational pull and that small atmosphere that's created during that process, it's pulled back into itself. And then in pulling it back into itself, it not only pulls the materials, it's going to pull in space itself, and then pulling in space, it overtakes those large bodies that are close to that object and pulling in those items in with it, creating a larger black hole if it has something to eat within that location other than small particles of photons and other things of that nature. So as it eats up everything, it's pulling in space, and then it's pulling until it actually comes to a sustainable position of just being a black hole where you can actually orbit around it as long as you don't get too close to the black hole, which is still pulling in space at a certain rate, but more like a fluid. You can actually just float around in a certain area in that orbit and maintain that orbit, not to be dragged in correlation to that sinkhole. So in its process of dissolving, it possibility is a normalization that happens, and space actually finally pushes and squeezes that object through, and the weight of the object itself and collecting a whole bunch of stuff that got too close to it starts dragging more and more space down, and space finds a equilibrium or equal normalization across it to where it can actually snip off that huge mass that pulled it and grew over time. And on the other side is a portion of our universe that's not filled, or a mirrored universe itself, where the determining factor as to how much materials has already sunk into the space can determine how much of that space can sustain that small universe that should disperse, being a white hole, which they haven't seen that in our own space. So that means we might have an abundance of certain materials within our space, although so ever expanding. So with that white hole, determining on the constitution of the space is actually expanding into, if there's enough materials to actually have resistance to that new material coming in or being able to sustain that material, it can determine whether or not that small universe that is created has, no matter how much materials in it, can sustain within that space and start forming with already existing materials in the space and creating and expanding much slower than a weaker constitution of a universe on the other side that will immediately rip that material out, and all that material disperses within that space. But that was just a thought, because I do watch a lot of information regarding scientific studies and all that stuff. So I'm sort of like more like a hobbyist of the subject, although the subject doesn't really have that much evidence for the topic in which I'm actually speaking on, because we can't really get close to a black hole to see these things, or we can't really experience that process to its fullest and be able to control the whole situation itself to see if it actually does react in these variant ideals that I just presented. So everything's a possibility, but it has to be mathematically sound in order for it to actually make sense as a possibility within the space of our own understanding of scientific research and study. So if they can mathematically come up with an equation for it, then it's a possibility. It doesn't mean that it's true or false. It just, we haven't observed it, so therefore we can't actually say if it's 100% fact that this is why black holes come into flourishing or something of that nature. But all the other stuff that I presented, such as the possibility of the atmosphere being created even in a greater abundance around the area, that might be fact or fiction. I didn't look it up. I just thought about it, and then I was thinking, in that understanding that small atmosphere based on the body in which is actually around it, it has to be a certain mass in order to create that atmosphere and have some chemical reactions happening on it in order to create that atmosphere around it. So it has to have multitudes of something that's happening on it in order for it to actually create an atmosphere around it itself to some degree. And then based on the materials within that space, it create a thick atmosphere that's a runaway planet, sort of like Venus, or a very thin one like Mars, or some of that nature. Or you got Jupiter as well, which is full of abundance of few or multitude of many chemical reactions happening, and a whole bunch of pressure also, and the possibility of it being a sun but too small to actually become one. Then also my presentation of or me presenting that space is dragged down by that material, that could be looked up as well. And there are certain other things that I presented here too that could be already researched and already determined whether or not those things can be true or indeed can happen. And even if the math actually shows we haven't observed it, doesn't mean that it's true or false. It just means that the scientific tool of mathematics that we're using actually can determine that that is a possibility. But is it a possibility or occurrence that happens in our own universe where it might actually reside or happen within another universe or another area of the universe in which we actually reside but can't observe at the moment in time? But that was just a fun idea and a fun thought experiment, I suppose. And I'm gonna post my comment now. I got OBS. I could be recording this right now on my screen, but I haven't started using it, and I have an anemic PC, so I don't really want to cause it too much harm with a Core i3 in it. So other than that, yeah, that's pretty much it. That's one topic I'm going to speak on today. I also speak on science. That's pretty much what Evolving Markets Coalition is. We don't stop anywhere. It's people in general and those markets that actually extend from people such as e-commerce, from that to science and also employment, homelessness, everything is covered. And with that said, thanks for listening. Like, share, subscribe. I'm out. Yeah, I forgot to say one more thing. We'll be quick because I only get 15 minutes to actually put up a video, being a new channel now. I watched 5 minutes and 24 seconds of a video, and something caught my ear. He says that we can measure distance and how fast I'm traveling based on light being observed from our location. Probably heard that wrong. But other than that, here's my thought in half hearing what he said. Could it also be possible that the galaxy is having dying light, which is giving us a false positive if something's actually traveling farther away from us? Is there a possibility that there's a stationary universe that's the same distance from us, but it's growing weaker over time, where the light actually traveling to us is giving us a false positive of the galaxy traveling away from us? But I'm pretty sure they got other ways to measure distance besides just using light, because that is a possibility of being a thing. So maybe they use gravitational fields or something like that to actually see if the gravitational field is still the same strength as it was, and if it's the same, then that means the light just grows weaker, not the expansion, or it's not expanding farther away from our location, if you get what I'm saying. So that's just a side note that I want to add in there. Being only watching 5 minutes, a little bit roughly over 5 minutes of the video, which is 17 minutes long. So it gets my brain juices going just thinking about all of this. Although not being a scientist, I do like science, and it tries to explain things, and I like its openness to actually push forward, hearing everyone's assumptions or ideas or notions to what actually is being explained to them, because I'm relying on the professionals that actually studied in it give me something, and then I think about it, and it's a possibility they already thought of this, and then they can explain that in terms of how they actually do it, only on layman terms to somebody like me that's not actually a part of their field study. So, like I said before, and this the real one, like, share, subscribe. Thank you. I'm out. Should really start finishing the videos instead of actually watching some of it, think about something, then write it down as a comment before actually coming to a realization that they explained it. So yeah, it's probably one of my things that I should look into finishing it. But then when I have a thought, I'm not concentrating on what else they're talking about. And then I have the thought, I have to pause, then I have to write out my comment, then I go back into it and do that. But this time for real, like, share, subscribe, comment. I'm out.